Hello, and first content-based meeting of the Arctic Summer College 2018. I'm Brendan O'Donnell in Berlin this week, and we're looking forward to our first opportunity to really dive into some of the subject matters that we've prepared for this year's sessions. I want to let you know that we're going to go pretty quickly into the presentations this week. We're very lucky. The two presenters that we have will have kind of a good thread between the presentations. Bernhard Diekmann, who's in Potsdam here in Germany, will be talking about the changing Arctic environments. And then, unfortunately, our original presenter, who was an alum from last year's Arctic Summer College program, had a family emergency and is unable to join us this week. However, Dr. Katia Kontar from Tufts University has agreed to share her research with us, which is quite exciting because she talks about the science diplomacy where the relationship with reducing disaster risks in the Arctic. And this, I think, will be a good connection with what Mr. Diekmann is going to present us this week. I also want to let you know that the initiator, the originator of the Arctic Summer College program, Andreas Kremer, who did introduce himself by way of our Facebook group, as many of you would have noticed, is with us today, so maybe he'll be able to share a few words. He's in Washington, D.C. We've switched places for the time being. He is celebrating the 10th anniversary of Ecologic Institute in Washington. And had, I must say, a whirlwind 24 hours between the events yesterday and today. So I'm glad that he's able to be a part of our session this afternoon. Arna from Ecologic in Berlin will do most of the moderation during the presentations and help lead the discussions following each presentation. And I wanted to let you know also that questions regarding the group presentations we can deal with after the session presentations today. So I'll stay on a little bit longer to talk directly if anybody has specific questions, and we can talk about how things are working with Asana and if your groups are coming together pretty well. So Arna, I guess I would say I'll hand it over to you if you want to introduce our first speaker and get the session started.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and welcome all of you. I've been just reminded that some of you weren't able to introduce themselves to the group last week because either you weren't able to participate in the test webinar or you had some audio problems. So seeing that we have 9 attendees right now, I think it might make sense. So if you feel you want to introduce yourself to the group, please click on the raise your hand button, and then we can give you the microphone and give you the chance to sort of introduce yourselves to the group. When that's the case, that would be great. So I'll just give you sort of a 30-second time window to contemplate whether you want that or not. Let's see. All right. There is Diane. Diane, you've got the mic.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me. My name is Diane Yoder, adjunct professor at the University of Southern California, and I am moving my research from administrative ethics and collaborative governance into those areas, but specifically within the region of the Arctic. So I'm very excited to be a part of the Arctic Summer College.
Great. We're happy to have you, Diane. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Anyone else who wants to introduce themselves? I mean, some of you already posted something in the Facebook group, so of course we can exchange there as well during the sessions, after the sessions, and between the sessions. I think that's the primary tool where you can sort of meet the rest of the cohort as well. But without further ado, and to try to keep our strict timeline, I'm happy to introduce Bernhard Diekmann, who has kindly agreed to talk to us today about Arctic environments and change. I think it's the perfect topic to kick us off with this year's Arctic Summer College topical sessions. It's not only within our scope of the sort of environmental sciences, but gives us really a sense of why we are actually talking about Arctic issues now and what are the most pressing issues. Bernhard Diekmann is the head of the research unit Potsdam of the Alfred Wegener Institute, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research, the biggest polar research institute and a contributor to Arctic science in Germany. He's adjunct professor for quaternary geology at the University of Potsdam as well. And he's a geologist by trade. So he has been investigating Earth history in the European Alps and East Africa already for his doctoral thesis, but also has dealt with past environmental changes in Siberia, Central Asia, and the polar oceans. So I think that's really, there's no better way to provide us with a view into history and to the present pressures and stresses in the Arctic region than him. So Bernhard Diekmann, welcome to the program. You have the word and the control, so please start your presentation when you're ready. And for the time being, we will fade our cameras off and mute ourselves, so the attention will be just on you and your presentation. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for introduction. So first I have to get in my presentation again. So just a minute.
And just to add, while you're starting the presentation, if you have any questions, Arctic Summer College fellows, then feel free to type away in the question box. We can gather those questions in the course of the presentation, and no worries, you don't have to spell out every detail of the question. Just let us know sort of what's the main topic, if it's whatever, oceans or ocean warming or glaciers melting, for instance, and then we'll be happy to sort of sort the topics a little bit to organize and structure the discussion, and so nothing's lost, but you get to ask your question yourself. So really, the chat window or the question window is just there to gather the input and give us an idea of what you want to talk about and who's going to be there first. And then we'll assign you the microphone, and then you can ask the question. So feel free during the presentation, anything that crosses your mind that you would like to ask or further specify, feel free to let us know in the question box, and then we can start the discussion directly after the presentation. Great.
Ich frage jetzt nochmal kurz auf Deutsch.
Ja.
Wo muss ich draufdrücken, um die Präsentation zu kriegen?
Bildschirm, also Präsentation teilen. Ich schaue gerade nochmal, das müsste klappen. Sorry, there we go. Share my screen. I think that's the key button. It's sort of on sharing, and then it's sort of, you can select the window to start it and hit the main button.
Achso, nur ein Fenster.
All right, there we go. I can see it just fine, and I'll mute myself, and the floor is yours.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, now I see myself.
Yeah, you can also sort of see what others are seeing. There's like an extra little click on the side, sort of for the audience view, and then you can see which slide is being shown currently. But it's the same as on your screen. So if you just follow your own screen, we'll see what you see.
Sorry, so during the rehearsal it worked. But I only can see myself, not the presentation.
Just now we could see a presentation. So just do what you did before, share that window, and then you can just continue. And no worries, it just updates automatically when you go forward. That's the whole screen, but if you can limit it to the presentation window.
Slowly.
No worries. maybe just to jump in here. So for the Arctic Summer College Fellows, you will experience the trickiness and level of technical detail of this program a little bit later in the program when you will be hosting your group presentations. So you can be aware of that. There's somewhat of a learning curve, but I think it's manageable. I can see the presentation now, wonderful. And yeah, there we go.
We don't do the presentation mode. You can see everything now. Yeah?
I can see it wonderfully, and let me know when I should ask the polls.
For me, it's the first time that I do such kind of webinar. I'm normally used to talks, so excuse me for this. So now let's come to the topic. Yeah, it's almost a pleasure for a polar scientist to talk about the natural background of Arctic climate warming. And first, I would like to start with a question for you. I think you prepared this. So the question is, what is changing in the Arctic?
So that's one of the polls, dear Arctic Summer College Fellows. So you can click now as the participants on one of the options and choose what you believe is the biggest impact of climate change on the Arctic region. So feel free to click on the slide, and I can see how many of you voted, and I'll try to give each and every one of you the chance to participate. And then afterwards we can see immediately the results and can see, so Bernhard knows already like how the feeling is, and if the feeling is sort of right. I think there's just one more attendee who can vote or needs to vote. And then we can close the poll in a few seconds. All right, almost everybody did vote. And so interestingly enough, I'll share the screen. So we see, Bernhard, it's a clear vote for the sea ice reduction indeed. And nobody's going for the air temperatures. And so yeah, take that results, and I'm curious to learn what the real answer is.
Yeah, okay. So sea ice is a good guess of you. So, but there are a lot of other things going on in the Arctic, and this is something I want to highlight now in this presentation. So you all know that we are living in a warming world, and so there was slight break in the last decade, but now during the last years it's going very quickly up, how you can see it in the curve. And so most scientists agree that climate warming is caused by human impact. It's not so nice that there are always unpleasant polemic discussion about this fact, but I think most people agree to this. And if you need some arguments in the discussion for climate warming, you can look here at the development of trace house gases, CO2, in Antarctic ice cores. This is for the last 100,000 years. And you see that there is quite a variability of CO2 in the atmosphere, which has to do with ice ages and warm stages in between. So it's in a distinct range. And if you add now the values of our time since the 1960s, you see that we reach a higher limit of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is not possible under natural conditions. So this is the most important argument for the human impact of climate warming. Now,
just a quick question. I think we still see the results slide. Maybe you could reiterate on the sharing screen that your presentation is coming back on top again. I think the poll has sort of superseded your presentation. So if you could just make sure that the showing screen is going back to the presentation. Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I closed the poll and it should hide again. So
poll in the upper part. But here, my presentation will be.
So let me try to show it again, and then I'll hide it again. But it doesn't automatically change back to your presentation. Maybe you can start sharing that window of your screen once more. But then it should be all set.
So not working.
Okay.
I'm showing the PDF on my screen.
Right.
Sure.
And you click on the screen sharing. All right, maybe it's just me. So apparently the colleagues from the webinar can see the PDF screen on page 2. Question for you. Is that the right slide that you had in mind, Bernhard?
I have a slide with a curve.
Okay, then we are off a little bit. So maybe if you can sort of stop sharing the screen for a second and start sharing it again, that would be wonderful. We need to override the system here, apparently. Sorry, Arctic Summer College fellows, for that. It's just one of those technical hiccups that can happen. But I hope you'll forgive us for the second.
So it's showing the Acrobat as a submission, but not in. Ich sag's mal auf Deutsch. Also oben steht Acrobat wird übertragen, aber da ist trotzdem diese andere Abbildung noch, die Sie eben rein.
Genau, einmal vielleicht auf Stop Showing Screen klicken und dann nochmal, also daneben müsste
Übertragung beenden.
Genau, und jetzt einfach nochmal starten. Genau, das müsste es machen.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bernhard. I'll go off again, and the stage is yours.
So that's what I already mentioned, the climate warming and human impact, polemic discussion. And if you need arguments, here is the variability of CO2 in the atmosphere during natural climate forcing of the last 800,000 years, as recorded in ice cores in Antarctica. And if you add the modern values from the last decades, you see that we are strongly exceeding the CO2 concentrations under natural conditions. The human impact is the most reasonable issue to explain modern climate warming. But we are now talking about the Arctic, and this figure from the last climate report, the International Climate Report. And what you basically see here is in reddish colors and yellowish colors that the world warmed up over the last 60 years. And you can see the reddish colors in the far north, so in the Arctic regions. And it seems that climate warming in the Arctic is even stronger than on a global mean. So, and this is something the scientists refer to as the Arctic amplification effect. And what does it mean? This is shown here. So the effect normally is that you have wide areas, wide land cover by ice, snow, and things like this. And the bit of sunlight coming mainly during the summer season is reflected back to the orbit under normal conditions. But now during climate warming, we see that all these wide areas disappear early in the year, so spring is earlier. And so this means that not so much sunlight is reflected back to the orbit, and this leads to an additional warming of the Arctic. With some of the effects, we can observe the positive feedback process in the climate system. There are many other processes which can exaggerate climate change. So we're from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. We are dealing with many compartments of the Arctic region to understand the processes which are going on in climate change. And I want to touch now some aspects of this. And what I just mentioned in the beginning of the talk, what about glacial melt? And you have to keep in mind that Greenland ice sheet is a remnant of the ice sheet of the last ice age, some 20,000 years ago, when big parts of Northern Europe and North America were covered by ice. This disappeared after the last ice age. And now we have something left in Greenland. But this is also not so stable. What we see here from colleagues from Bremerhaven, that's a measurement of glacial melt during the last years. But it's not so dramatic as the difference between ice ages and warm ages, and this is summarized here. So what we see today is a glacial melt which contributes to sea level rise, and this is about 1.2 millimeter per year, and another 1.6 millimeter comes from the thermal expansion of seawater. So this is, you see, we are talking about centimeters or decimeters, maybe meters in the future. For the geological timescale, this is not so much, but for the human impact, that's very dramatic if you think of the islands, of the tropical islands, for instance. But I also show you here how much is possible. So if Greenland will totally disappear the ice sheets, we have a sea level rise of about 6 to 7 meters. And if we talk about Antarctica, which hosts a lot of ice, so this can cause 65 meters. But this is something we cannot expect in the near future. And it's something which appeared during times when the dinosaurs lived on the world. So what we today guess is that, it's possible Greenland 6 to 7 meters and maybe another 5 meters from Western Antarctica. During the last ice age, we had about 140 meter lower sea level. So that's for comparison. So this is a climate change. The Arctic is affected by this, and we have to keep an eye on this. So now let's talk about sea ice. It's something which was correct in your answers. So that's a very dramatic situation. And we are investigating sea ice distribution in the Arctic from many perspectives. So we look on the ice and underneath the ice, measure ice thickness and the change of biology under the ice. This is a summary of the methods. And it's also important that we have the satellite view, so the remote sensing view, and they see the whole picture of sea ice change. And we have information about the last 30 to 40 years. This is something you can observe in the Meereisportal. This is something, joint activity by Alfred Wegener Institute and the University of Bremen. And what I show here on the figure is the situation on the upper left. So that's the sea ice distribution in spring. So that's the maximum extent in March, and you see the pinkish line. So this is a normal situation we had before human impact on climate change, so some decades ago. And an example from 2013. So that's not so much different. But if you look at the summer sea ice, which is measured in September, you also see this purple line, which is the limit we had some decades ago. And here you see the extent in September 2012. So that was the absolute minimum of sea ice extent. And this is also shown by the graphs to the right. So you see the upper graph. Since 1980, the extent diminished from 16 million square kilometers to 14 million square meters. It's not so dramatic, only a few regions where you can see it, in Spitzbergen, for instance. And on the lower part, you see that the summer sea ice is steadily decreasing from 8 million square kilometers to 4 square kilometers. So it's half the amount. And so this means if you talk about sun reflection, so during former times, the sunlight on the Arctic Ocean was almost totally reflected, and today we have a situation that a lot of sun heat is stored on the Arctic Ocean during summertime. So that's the next question for you. What do you think the consequence of this is? And the question is, what do you think about Arctic winters in recent years?
Again, your chance, fellows, to cast your vote. Unfortunately, us organizing panelists can't vote, so we are excluded from that fun. But you are more than welcome to cast your vote now. We have already 2/3 who participated. The rest joining in now. And I think I'll close the vote in 5 seconds. So last chance right now. Wonderful. And we've got a result to share. Okay, almost 2/3 for the warmer than usual. The rest, but nobody's seeing like a continuing trend. But Bernhard, again, like before, if maybe you can stop and start sharing the screen again, so then we can go. Oh no, actually it's.
Oh, it worked.
Wonderful. Oh. That's how it should be. Second time's a charm. So please enlighten us what the truth is.
Yeah, so actually both answers are right. So on average, the winters are becoming warmer, of course. But what we see during the last years are extremes. So we have extreme situations in wintertime, very warm and mild. And on the other hand, we have very cold spells. So this is shown an impression from our German weather forecast. So that was a situation in 2013, so in early January of 2014. And this is a picture which repeatedly could be seen during the last winters. So on the one hand, on this figure you see here in Europe, we had mild air masses coming from the subtropical realm to Europe and brought very mild winter. And on the other hand, in North America, especially New York, we had this breakout of cold air masses from the Arctic far to the south. So this is, and these cold winters in New York repeatedly appeared during the last year. It's something I always observe in the weather forecasts. And in our house, we have atmospheric researchers here in Potsdam who are dealing with this phenomenon. And this possibly has to do, it's not fully understood so far. This might have something to do with the situation in the Arctic. And here you see the circulation patterns in the atmosphere on the left side, the normal situation. So polar air masses in the Arctic are isolated from the south. They have a very zonal jet stream. This is something you know from the flights from New York to Europe. And so the Arctic is isolated in mostly during former times. So, and today we observe now that the Arctic Ocean is warming. I already explained this with this barren country and blue sea exposed to the sunlight. And this means the gradient broke down. So the gradients between warm and cold are not as strong as in former times. And this means that the air masses began to move wavily. As also, you know something from rivers, which are in the flat plain and begin to meander. So, and this means the jet stream is meandering, wavy movement, and this can cause the penetration of cold air masses to the lower latitudes. And on the other hand, you can have this very mild air masses from subtropical regions up to the mid-latitudes. So this is a phenomenon we have to observe in the next years and also do climate modeling to verify this. So this is a candidate which may be important for the understanding of our weather patterns. And that's the question, what do we have to do with the Arctic? And this is an answer to this. We get extreme weather conditions, extreme in two directions. So this means on the one hand, mild winters, or on the other hand, very strong winters. So now let's talk a bit about the threat of Arctic fauna. So it's warming, and this is also shown not only by the polar bears, but also by fish. So we have a station in Svalbard, and there we can see that polar codfish is driven away by Atlantic codfish. So there's a change in the biology in the Arctic going on. You can also see with the polar bears and with the microalgae, for instance. This is something studied by the biologists at Alfred Wegener Institute. And we also have a observatory, a deep sea observatory close to Svalbard, referred to as the House Garden. And there you can see on the lower right graph that not only the surface waters are warm, but also the bottom waters. Another interesting thing, which has not to do with Arctic warming, but it's also a discussion during the last years, is plastic waste, which can also be found in that region in our deep sea observatory. So it just reached this position. It's not only on the tropical beaches and in the open ocean with this plastic waste, it also reaches the polar regions. Now let's go to the land. So we just talked about the cryosphere, the atmosphere, and we also have land masses, especially in Siberia, for instance, which are underlain by permanently frozen underground, which can maybe as thick as several hundreds meters. And this is especially in Siberia, where we realized where we had no glacial ice during the last ice ages. So the landscape, the barren landscape, was exposed to very strong cold conditions. But what the permafrost seems to be quite stable, but not on the surface. So the surface of permafrost, the surface, this means the upper 1 to 2 meters, thaws during summertime, and there seems to be a trend that this thawing goes on and is longer. So the warm season is longer in Siberia, and this causes a wettening of the surfaces. A lot of ponds and lakes appear, and the upper surface is thawing, and there's biological productivity. So you can imagine that permafrost is a refrigerator with a lot of organic carbon stored in, and now this warms up and there's bacterial attack, and then a lot of gases are released, such as methane and CO2, which contribute to the icehouse effect, to the greenhouse effect. So this is an example. On this map you see the trends in future. So all these yellow colors show where permafrost is quite stable, but in the marginal parts, the reddish parts, it will disappear until the end of the century. And you can also see in boreholes that permafrost is warming in these curves on the right side. So it's still freezing under 0 degrees, but we have a warming trend. But as I mentioned, the most severe processes appear at the surface, and this has consequences for infrastructure. As we can see here, it's not only in Northern America and Siberia, but also on the Tibetan Plateau, for instance, in China, where we also have this permafrost. So, and as I already mentioned, permafrost includes a lot of carbon which has been enriched during the last glacial cycles. So you can say the last 2 million years. And if you compare this with the global budget of carbon, you see that a huge amount of carbon is stored in this refrigerator of permafrost. And if you open your cooling house at home, you can also see you have your food in the refrigerator, and you begin to thaw it. What happens? It becomes worse and decays, and there's a release of gases, and this also appears in the permafrost regions. And my colleague Guido Grosse, here also from RW Potsdam, he is dealing a lot with this change in permafrost and the release of greenhouse gases. And there's a perspective that there might be the current temperature warming in the Arctic, that about 1/4 of a degree might be caused by this release of trace gases from the permafrost regions. So this is another positive feedback effect on climate change. So we already saw with the reflection effect. Another feature we can observe in the Arctic, so that's a consequence also of sea ice retreat. So we have a lot of open water in the Arctic Ocean. And these open water areas are prone to wind attack. So we have high waves now reaching the coasts of the Arctic. And this leads to the erosion of Arctic coast. So the erosion, the Arctic coast is already weakened by permafrost decay. And then the ocean, the strong storms, they tend to enhance the erosion of coastal materials, of permafrost materials. And this is another process which leads to the release of carbon and might enhance the greenhouse effect. So this brings me to my last example of what's going on in the Arctic. And we also have to consider life on land. So I just mentioned life in the ocean. And life on land means we have an extended area of boreal forests on the northern hemisphere in the higher latitudes, and tundra vegetation close to the coast. And there's also a reflection effect again, so the tundra reflects more sunlight than the boreal forests. And what we can see is that the tundra regions are now overgrown by boreal forests. But this is not so clear until now. So there seems to be a delay in the response of the vegetation. That's something done by my colleague Ulrike Herzschuh, who is dealing with the vegetation change in the Arctic region. So what we can see is that there's a strong warming now in the Arctic, but the tree line seems to persist a bit at the prominent position it had already decades ago. So what we can see is that some trees now entering the tundra but it can be expected that in the next decades the tree line will move. So this is studied in very much detail also with genetic aspects. Well, it's something we have to expect in the future, that the forests again return to the Arctic coastlines. This is something which is also demonstrated by geological studies. So the important thing is that if we're talking about Arctic climate change, is this a unique feature? So we can model it with computer simulation model runs. And indeed, we can expect that the Arctic may warm up to 12 degrees in the next 100 years. And is it a unique feature? And we know from Earth history studies, so we have materials, geological records, which give us indication of warming some 120,000 years ago, for instance. That was the last warm stage before the last ice age. And there we also had the conditions that it was quite warm in the Arctic, but this was under natural conditions. So with this, I want to finish. And the main message is that there's a lot of change going on in the Arctic, and only few people can see this. These are the indigenous people, a few people living in the Arctic realm, and some tourists maybe. But most people are not aware of these changes, and so this is our task to explain these changes to the wider audience, to the people. And I also have demonstrated that the Arctic changes, they have strong impact on the global environment. So this, let's start with the sea level rise, which is triggered by the polar regions. Then we heard about the sea ice distribution, which can change the weather conditions, even in the mid-latitudes. Then we heard about the permafrost release of tracehouse gases, which also can enhance the greenhouse effect we observe today. And this also affect the whole humankind on Earth. Okay, so I'm at the end and I'm open for questions now and discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful, Bernhard. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think it gives us really a tour de force through the changes that the Arctic environment is facing. And I really like the rundown through the different aspects. So I think, well, I do have a couple of questions already, but I don't want to get ahead of myself and don't want to jump ahead of our Arctic Summer College fellows. So if you have a question that can be deepening a little bit into a specific aspect, be it permafrost, be it glaciers or sea ice, be it somewhat towards what Bernhard mentioned at the end, the links to the mid-latitudes and sort of the impacts on ourselves in Europe and the northern US, for instance, let us know. Just give us like a little bit of a clue, like in which direction your question is going, and then I can assign the mic to you. While you're sort of thinking of the questions and starting to type some questions, I'll start off with maybe just two follow-up questions, Bernhard. You've mentioned sort of the impacts on the environment, but I was wondering, I know there has been some research being done on tipping points, sort of where are some points of a no return, if you will, where certain conditions have changed that at least with existing technologies, mankind cannot reverse that development. I was just wondering specifically with regards sort of to glacier runoff. You mentioned sea level rise and the Greenland ice sheet. Is there any sort of recent knowledge you can share with that, sort of like how far we are away from any tipping point, if that exists? And the second one would be, you mentioned permafrost and its impact on infrastructure. But to my knowledge, also there's a lot of course, methane and greenhouse gases entrapped in this permafrost. So once that sort of further thaws, it also releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And there were some warnings a couple of years back. I think Mr. Wadham from the Cambridge University was referring to as a sort of a permafrost bomb, like a carbon bomb that would be released when we go beyond these tipping points. Can you give me a little bit of a understanding how recent my knowledge is there, and update us a little bit on that?
Mm-hmm. So let's start with the tipping points. So if you pass a threshold, then it's difficult to do reversible process. So yeah, let's define tipping point maybe that way, that we have a very sudden change, and it takes an even longer time to get back to the situation we have before. So this is one example, might be the ice sheet coverage of Greenland. So as long if you have ice present, this is fine, because this is a white surface and a cold surface. If you have no snow falling on the ice, then there's a big chance that you can preserve the snow and the ice. So, but now it's a slow process. So it's retreating the ice, but it's a slow process. But once it disappears, it's much more difficult to produce new snow and ice, because it's falling on the barren and dark ground. So this is an example of a tipping point. Another tipping point, which is often mentioned, is something which I did not address in the talk. It's the ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. So that you know that we are living in Europe, and we get heat from the Gulf Stream. So the Gulf Stream delivers some energy to Europe, and this Gulf Stream is only a compartment of the whole ocean circulation. And if you follow the Gulf Stream to the North Atlantic, there it goes down and forms deep water, because it's heavy. It's salty water, it meets cold water, it's heavy, and then it goes down to the deep ocean floor and produces a suction effect. So the problem is, if you have a lot of fresh water from permafrost melt or from ice melt into the ocean, then the Arctic Ocean becomes also fresher. And this might cause a process that the deep water production will ease. So that's also a threshold, a tipping point. So we had such tipping points in Earth history, but today we can see that there might be a slowing of this ocean circulation, but we are still far away from it that it ceases. So another example of tipping point which we are dealing with is, for instance, the forests in Siberia. We just talked about the forests, and so there might be a chance that the large forest we had from the last ice age, so that's a very specific item. If it's going on with the disappearance of large forests and you have pine forests coming, then you will never get back the large forest. So that's a tipping point which also has human consequences. And for the permafrost also, if the permafrost would disappear totally, then it would also be more difficult to get it back again. But the permafrost is a system which also existed since 2.5 million years. So the surface is a problem, and not the deeper part of it. So that's a question for tipping points. The other, you mentioned greenhouse gases from permafrost. So how does it work? So the one important process is you have the permafrost surface. During winter time it's frozen, and then in spring and summer the upper 2 meters or so, meter to 2 meters, are thawing, and permafrost warms, and then you have a lot of biological activity, and the microbes, they enhance the decay of organic matter stored in the permafrost. So this means the organic matter which was stored there, now begins to decay and produces CO2 and methane. And methane is a very bad gas. So this is one example. Another process which I did not mention is that we have gas hydrates underneath the permafrost. I'm not sure whether you heard about gas hydrates. This is basically frozen ice with methane gas included in ice cages. And these gas hydrates are only stable under cold conditions and under high pressure. So they are under the permafrost, they have an overloading of the Earth's crust. And what we now can see is the permafrost is weakening, and this might take some pressure from the system, and this can lead to the destabilization of gas hydrates. And this is something you can see if you're cruising along the coast of Siberia. There are gas bubbles coming up. So this is from the gas hydrates underneath. And maybe you heard in the news that there are big holes which appear on Yamal Island. I think it's 4 years ago or so. And these were explosive holes. And this had to do with gas resources in that area. So, and which were weakened and suddenly were pushed out of the ground. So this is a very serious topic. We know it from Earth's history. So 55 million years ago, it happened that there was a big release of gas hydrates, and this leads to a warming of 5 degrees. But this also is associated with subaquatic landslides, for instance. So, and the third process which I mentioned is the erosion of the coastline, and this brings carbon organic particles to the ocean, and that can also transform to other organic compounds under the release of gases such as methane and CO2.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's helping my understanding. And of course, Arctic Summer College Fellows, you're more than welcome to chime in and follow up on the explanations that Bernhard just gave. I think I sort of can sleep more easy tonight, learning that this is still a horrible scenario, but at least somewhat more a little down the road, at least, not going to happen next year. Regarding
No.
sort of the permafrost bomb.
So the permafrost bomb, yeah, of course, it's a bomb. Depends on the time frame, you think. So yeah, we have to keep an eye on this. That's very important, and it's a serious problem, of course. But the most serious problem, or the most strong response, is the sea ice decrease.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we do have 2 questions that popped up during one is linked a little more into the policy territory and sort of the impacts, and Diane authorized me to read it, but I'm more than happy to give someone else the mic, so we have a little more wide range in the voices that everyone is hearing. So Diane, if you're prepared, I'll give you the mic now.
Well, first, my apologies for the Trump administration to everyone. My question has to do with Trump and his withdrawal from the Paris Treaty, and also his extreme anti-environmental views and policies here in the United States. Has anyone started to game out or started to understand and predict what kinds of changes will happen in the Arctic because of the Trump administration?
Once again, you're from the US, or?
Yes, I'm in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, okay. So I don't want to talk negatively about your president. So that's
please do.
Yeah, so that was elected by all Americans. Yeah, of course, we are not happy with this, so we also have our problems. Yeah, it's quite annoying that we stopped this process of climate politics with Paris and things like this. But it's also astonishing. I just mentioned this situation with the cold winters in New York. And this is something which is really hard to explain to people who have no scientific background. So that cooling can be caused by warming. So that's a negative feedback of the climate change. And the most important task we have as researchers is to explain to people what's going on. And we have to explain it in a way that they can understand it, that the stakeholders. And Donald Trump is a challenge. I would like to talk to him and convince him of this, what I have shown him. So I can imagine it's not so easy. So, but your other question was what Trump already has caused in the climate change. Now, I think it's now 2 years in the administration. And what we see today, the changes in the Arctic, this is something which was caused many years ago. So that's the problem with the climate system. So there's always a delay in the climate system, which is something we can also see from Earth history. So if we have the strongest sunlight inflection on Earth, so the reaction of the climate system is much later on. And this is also climate change the humans cause today. So what we already have done will be seen in 10 years or so. And that's a problem. And if we want to return back to the conditions we had, it will take even longer. And that's also the problems with the stakeholder and the politicians. They want to do something directly. They want to have a tipping point. So they want to switch off the CO2 release and hope that during their period of administration, that will something change. But unfortunately, it will not happen. So if we change something in climate politics, like the 2-degree goal, the effects will be seen in a few decades. But we have to stop now for the next generation.
Thank you very much. Diane, if you agree, or let us have a follow-up questions by Tuli. I think she's sort of tapping into that question, and then afterwards we have another question from Autumn Lin. And after these two questions, I would suggest that we proceed with our second expert speaker, and of course can come back to these topics. But I think also Katia's presentation regarding science diplomacy and how to respond to disaster will also tap into some of these sort of questions. How can we make this pressure and this immediate changes, how can we make them felt, and how can we translate that into effective policy? But Tuli, you've got a follow-up question, so the floor is yours now, and after that it's Autumn Lin.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Diekmann, for your presentation. Greetings from Finland. So, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So, I was thinking that because the United States has now left the Paris Treaty, so I'm writing my master's thesis about the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Council has been and is an institution where both Russia and the United States are active. And they are part of that institution and no longer part of the UNFCCC. So do you think that the Arctic Council could be in the future an active player in the climate policy and that kind of awareness builder in that sense, because the United States is still there? So the science diplomacy or science policy interplay could have a role there. Do you think so?
Yeah, the Arctic Council is very important, and also Germany is a partner of this Arctic Council.
Yes.
And what you're talking about is this stakeholder interaction. And yeah, many meetings with this, and also in my institute here, we have the so-called Arctic Office. It's led by Volker Rachold, and he is putting forward the scientific results of stakeholders. And one example is next year, there will be a meeting in Germany where all the science ministers from different countries will join in Berlin, and they will be explained what's going on in the Arctic. And we hope that the ministers will tell this the leaders of their countries. So that's one thing to do. And on the other hand, we have the IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change, which already got the Nobel Prize, Nobel Award some years ago. And there's also included this Arctic topic. So we are doing our best to put forward this, and the outreach activities are more and more important also for the researchers. So, you know, during former times, we always had to do poor science, so to understand the natural processes. And now it's important to tell stakeholders about our findings and the consequences for the society.
And if you let me add that, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's also what we're now.
Right. I was just going to add, so the Arctic Science Ministerial is actually already going to be late October this year. So it's going to be even sooner. And I think Berlin will be very proud to host such a sort of Arctic event. And so if any one of you should be able to visit the Arctic Science Ministerial, please let us know and say hi to Ecologic as well, since we're also going to host 2 side events to the Arctic Science Ministerial. So please let us know if you show up. Great, and maybe just to add on that, Tuli, I understood you that you mentioned that US and Russia wouldn't be part of the UNFCCC negotiations. That isn't quite accurate. I'm happen to be part in another project to supporting the German Environmental Ministry in the climate negotiations. So the US has announced the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, but they haven't actually handed in that. So they can only do that after the agreement has entered into force 3 years after that, and then it will take another year to enter into effect. So while they have announced it, and there's no reason to believe that Mr. Trump will change his mind anytime soon, it's actually there's still US negotiators on the floor and being active there, and not new ones, but really ones who have been there since the Obama administration before. So there's experienced staff still going there and really negotiating actually quite productively. Just to give you like a little bit of feedback on that, it's not that there's nobody going to the UNFCCC anymore. And Russia actually signed the Paris Agreement. I think they haven't ratified it yet, but they are thinking they will be part of that treaty as well. So Russia and the US are still engaged in discussions, and whether the US will actually withdraw, we'll have to see in 2019. And but thank you for the question, and thanks for Bernhard for the quick answer and showing Germany's willingness to contribute to some active discussions in the Arctic Council. Autumn Lynn, the floor is yours, and you've got the mic now.
Thank you so much. You can hear me? Yes?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you for that excellent presentation. That definitely filled in some gaps for me. I'm a researcher of migratory species at the Smithsonian Institution, and I'm curious about your personal reflections. I don't want to presume too much by your silver hair, but I'm guessing that maybe you've studied these issues perhaps for decades, but at least for years. And I'm curious, in the course of your work, are there any changes that were unexpected or that surprised you, or any findings today that weren't even on your radar years ago?
So I'm a geologist by training, and a geologist is dealing with Earth's history. And yeah, the geologist didn't care about modern processes, or even all the sand on the surface of the Earth is not important. But this changed dramatically during the last years. So when I started with geology, everybody was looking for hard rocks and looking for petrol and coal, so for the resources. And then it turned out that there's something going on, that there's something like climate change. So there were a few researchers who dealt with climate change in the past, but now it turned on that there's something going on with climate change, the modern warming. And this led geologists to the view, maybe we can learn something from the past. So we went to younger and younger times. So we started then for the dinosaur time until now. Then we were looking at the last ice age and the beginning of our warm stage now. And meanwhile, we are looking for the last 1,000 years, for instance. So the Middle Age was the last warm stage, and then there was Cold Age during the last millennium, and then it became warmer again. So the time frames become younger and younger, and now we are looking at the last decades. And what's also important during former times, the so-called study of processes. So how the Earth system is working today, the environmental system. So that was not important. But today, the most research, even at the Alfred Wegener Institute, is devoted to the study of modern processes. And this actually, the cause for this is this change of the environment. And we have to understand this. And now the geologists can give some advice from their knowledge from the past.
Very interesting, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question and the answer. And if you indulge, I'm happy to go now to our second presenter, watching the time quickly running away for tonight's webinar. So Katia, if you would enable your webcam, and so I can introduce you to all of the participants. Wonderful. Great to see you again.
Now?
Yes, you can turn off the camera for the time being, but you're more than welcome to join us for the discussions later if you have time.
Of course.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bernhard. Katia, thank you so much. So, dear fellows, it's my pleasure to introduce our second expert speaker today, and we'll tap a little more into the field of science diplomacy, which we already sort of highlighted with the Arctic Science Ministerial coming up in the October of this year. Katia is a postdoctoral scholar at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at the Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts. She's focusing on science diplomacy with an emphasis on disaster resilience in the Arctic. And she studied before at the Uni of Alaska Fairbanks, so she actually has been studying in the Arctic and received a doctoral degree in science communication and policy. She was focusing on disaster risk reduction in rural Arctic communities. So I couldn't imagine someone else with actually like first-hand knowledge, having sort of a Russian background and a US study background, to bring together these two big players in the Arctic and to enlighten us on science diplomacy.
Oh,
so
thank you.
Welcome, Katia. I'll make you the presenter right now, and then you can start right now.
Okay, so okay, can you guys see my presentation?
It should come up any second now. Not yet.
Okay. Oh yes. Okay. Hold on a second.
You just start
Yes.
the button. Wonderful.
All
yes,
right.
we see
All
also
right.
the user interface. So if you can make it full screen, then even better. Wonderful. I'll be off, and the stage is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for such a generous introduction. Yes, we're going to switch gears just a little bit. We're going to focus more now on disasters in the Arctic, which of course are impacted by the climate change. And then we're going to talk about science diplomacy with the emphasis on disasters. So here's the brief outline of my presentation. First, I'm going to highlight some of the impacts of the environmental change on the Arctic disaster resilience. I'm going to then introduce the concept of disaster diplomacy in the Arctic. I'm going to introduce it from the viewpoint, from the diplomatic viewpoint, as well as academic viewpoint. And then I'm going to highlight some of the role of the international, interdisciplinary, and also multi-stakeholder collaborations in reducing disaster risk in the Arctic. Then I'll provide you with a case study on disaster diplomacy, which is based actually on my graduate research on my PhD. Then we'll talk about challenges to disaster diplomacy in the Arctic. And we finish on a bright note by looking forward in a quick summary. Excuse me, sorry, I just, okay, here we go. So, but before we go any further, I would like to make sure that we all speak in the same language, that we understand the terminology. So, considering that you probably all have very different backgrounds. So, what is disaster resilience exactly? Disaster resilience is the ability of a community which is exposed and vulnerable to hazards, such as, for example, floods or wildfires, to resist, adapt to, and recover from the adverse impacts of such hazard in a timely and efficient manner. Then I also would like to highlight that communities can be vulnerable due to different reasons. Mostly the most vulnerable populations are those who are marginalized and also poor. So I also would like to say that hazards are not disasters, even though those terms are often used interchangeably. Hazard is a natural process or technological accident or some kind of human activity that may cause death, injury, or environmental degradation. However, if it just happens and there is no people or infrastructure around, it is not a disaster. Hazards turns into disaster only if it causes adverse impacts to a community and its infrastructure. So, okay, now when we settled on terminology, I would like to say how disaster resilience is challenged in the changing Arctic. So Bernhard gave a wonderful presentation about the climate impacts in the Arctic, and of course, climate impacts have a lot of climate impacts are also obvious on disaster resilience, because right now with the warming temperatures, there is definitely higher human activity in the Arctic. Here is an example with the oil production in the Arctic. It is especially prominent in the Russian and yes.
If you allow me, apologies. I've been just notified that the fellows can see still the first slide. So did you forward? Otherwise, maybe you can sort of just make sure that you forward. There we go. Now it's updating.
Oh,
wonderful.
Okay. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. Just a technical glitch, but thank you, fellows, for making us aware. And maybe just restart the sharing of the screen, and that usually helps the trick.
Okay, is this working right now?
Now I can see it. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, would you like me to go back quickly to these previous slides? That was just terminology.
Yeah, maybe just for people to read it once more might be great. So I think we understood most of it, but in case there are any questions later, we can also clarify afterwards and go back to that.
Okay, good. So basically, I was saying that hazards are not disasters, which are usually used interchangeably. And disaster resilience is basically the ability of a community which is exposed and vulnerable, which are very important terms here, to hazards, to resist, adapt to, and recover from the adverse impacts of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. As I was saying, sorry, I just want to make sure, did the slide change now?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. Okay. So as Bernhard outlined in his presentation, Arctic is experiencing a lot of changing right now due to the climate change. The warming temperatures in the Arctic, of course, mean the increase in human activity, such as resource extraction, commercial shipping, tourism. Some may consider that these are new economic opportunities for the region, but they can also lead to a lot of challenges, because many of those activities can actually lead to technological or man-made disasters. So the disaster losses overall in the world are on the rise. So the frequency and the impacts of disasters are rising. So here on on your left, you can see a graphic which shows that the number of disasters which involve, especially climatological and meteorological, are rising steadily in the last 3 decades. At the same time, so these are disasters which are impacted by the change in climate, because you can see that the disasters which are geophysical, such as, for example, earthquakes or volcanic activities, which are not impacted by the climate, they are actually staying pretty much the same. So on the right, you can see that the financial losses associated with disasters are rising as well. So these are world trends. However, the climate reports for the Arctic also predict that natural disasters in the Arctic are going to rise as well in the future. And we can actually see it in the current day as well. So disaster resilience is also challenging in the Arctic overall, because disaster response and recovery is very challenging in the Arctic. Here, as you can see, a slide from Alaska, and that's one of my favorite examples to show that regional, unique regional challenges such as geographic location and climatological aspects make the Arctic region is very prone to challenging disaster response and recovery. So with Alaska, for example, you can see how far away it is from the capital of United States, Washington, D.C. So if disaster happens, actually the relief arrives usually much later than expected, and many Arctic countries, because of that, have to depend on their neighbors from the other countries, from the neighboring Arctic countries, for assistance. You can also see that Alaska has very limited infrastructure, such as highways and roads. So there are many communities which are remote, and when disaster happens in that community, it's very challenging to provide the timely assistance. And then, of course, we have challenges such as, prolonged winters and very dark winters, which also add to the additional challenges. So we really depend on our neighbors, and right now, at this point, no Arctic state is equipped to deal with a large disaster alone, especially if we talk about oil spills, which is a really high concern considering the more increased activity. And I believe it was Diana who asked what we can expect with the Trump administration in the Arctic. We can definitely expect more resource extraction and more commercial development. So it is very challenging, very concerning. So here it brings us to disaster diplomacy. So how does disaster diplomacy ties in with all of that? So as I mentioned, is that good neighborly relations in the Arctic are very important for disaster resilience. And disaster diplomacy is the use of expert collaborations to address challenges in disaster resilience while building and fostering peace between states where relations could otherwise be strained. So the original definition, or the most common definition, actually uses at the beginning the use of scientific collaborations, which I think is not exactly right, because when we talk about disasters, it's really important to engage not just academic experts in disasters, but also people who are non-academic experts, such as indigenous knowledge holders and emergency managers, of course, and the first responders. So disaster diplomacy, we can look at it from multiple sides. It takes multiple forms. We can look at it as a form of multi-track diplomacy, which combines official conflict resolution efforts, which are led by the governments, with peer-to-peer exchanges, such I mentioned, between academic experts and non-academic experts. And also, we can look at it as an academic discipline, which actually evaluates the effectiveness of disaster diplomacy efforts throughout the history. So disaster diplomacy also takes many forms, because it can originate on international, and also local levels, as well as before, during, and after disasters. So if you look at the graphic on your right, this is a disaster management cycle. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that. Usually, when we look at disasters, we look at disaster risk management, which takes place before disaster strikes, and it includes disaster prevention, mitigation, and preparation activities, and also disaster crisis management, which takes place after disaster strikes. So, in disaster diplomacy, can actually originate at any of these activities.
Sorry, Katia, just one question. Could you go back one slide? if that's possible. And just for the fellows who have been asking the question beforehand, if you can't see the small print details, there is the option to zoom in on the different windows. So you can actually adjust it, and the usual setup is scaled to fit. So you can also zoom to up to like a 400% and really go into the details of the slide. But we'll also try to provide, of course, the slides afterwards, so you can check back afterwards. Just sort of because that was like the perfect example of some very fine print, and sometimes depending on the screen resolution and what people's setup is for the slides, it might be hard to read. But yeah, feel free to click on the Zoom window. It should be on the top layer in your webinar software, and then you can clarify that. Sorry, Katia, for that, and thanks again.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, because I actually have few slides like that. So thank you for doing that. Okay, so as I mentioned before, disaster diplomacy incorporates many activities and can have government-led activities and just peer-to-peer exchanges. But the reason why it has to be inclusive, because disasters cannot be solved strictly by academic endeavors. So in order to actually enhance disaster resilience, we need to have proactive policies which promote disaster risk reduction. But for the proactive policies have to be based on coherent and comprehensive scientific assessment. In the scientific assessments, they also have to include academic and non-academic knowledge. So here we come to the case study, disaster diplomacy in practice. We're going to dive into my graduate research a little bit. I'll try not to focus too much on it. Just give you a quick introduction and share some what I think are more interesting results, and we move on with a more general theme of disaster diplomacy from there. So for my graduate work, I conducted a comparative case study to identify best practices in flood resilience in the US and Russian Arctic. I worked with two small communities, community of Galina in Alaska and community of Yedeytsi in Sakha Republic, Russia. That's in the far east Siberia. So as you can see, both of the communities, as you can see from these pictures, both of the communities suffered significant losses from a breakup flood, which took place in the spring of 2013, and both communities were flooded within a week of each other. Those of you who don't know what breakup flood is, or what we call ice jam flood, here is an example. Here, as you can see, community of Galina during the flood. So basically, the reason for the flooding is ice jam, which is accumulation of ice, which forms during the spring thaw. So sometimes the melting is not smooth, and the pieces of ice, such as you see here, they can get basically stuck in the river bands or shallow areas, and then the water and ice flood communities upstream in case of Galina, and sometimes when there is a very sudden release of an ice jam, it can flood communities downstream. And as you can imagine, the damage is pretty severe, because you have damage not just from water but also from the ice. So that's actually very northern specific hazard. So this is just to orient us in space, and I'm sorry, I just realized that one of my, oh no, sorry, I cannot see the screen completely, but here is just to orient us in space. Here is the map. You can see community of Galina in Alaska. It is located on the Yukon River, and you can see community of Yedeytsi. It is located on the Lena River. Here are some points of comparison for the case study. My dissertation focused specifically on the points which are highlighted in yellow. So in my work, I wanted to compare levels of flood awareness, monitoring and warning, also flood preparedness, flood management, and flood governance, and also the satisfaction levels of the impacted communities with the flood management efforts which existed in Alaska and Sakha Republic at that time. So here is to do this research, I put together a bilateral and interdisciplinary team. My team consisted of academic researchers who study breakup floods, as well as emergency managers, local administration, and indigenous administration of both communities. And also a bigger group consisted actually of policymakers on a bigger level, such on the state level, state of Alaska and also Sakha Republic. This project was funded, as you can see, by many different sources, but actually our main funding source was the US Department of State, US-Russia peer-to-peer program, which was very interesting because that project was right after the crisis in Ukraine, and despite all the sanctions, they still funded it. So that was very interesting. So basically, we conducted site visits in Galena in March 2016. We conducted focus groups, also some sessions at the scientific conference which were taking place in Alaska and Sakha Republic at that time, where it was the Arctic Science Summit Week in Alaska, which is a very big international conference. There is also the Northern Forum, which focuses mostly on Russia and Scandinavia. And so here are just some of the examples. In our focus groups, we had federal, state, regional, tribal agencies participating. And then, again, because the main reason for that was also not to just gather the data, but to create a dialogue between all these different groups within the state of Alaska and Sakha Republic, as well as to create the links between the peers, between the American and Russian peers. We also conducted surveys during the site visits with the local population. We predominantly focused on families which were impacted by the 2013 flooding. And here is the points of comparison from the surveys. Again, highlighted in yellow, that was specifically for my research. We focused on history of floods in Galena and Yedeytsi, socioeconomic impacts of the 2013 floods. We also focused on the mitigation and flood preparedness efforts, flood information and warning channels, and of course the assistance efforts which communities received from the government and non-governmental agencies. I also conducted archival review and direct observations. And here are just some of the more interesting findings, which I think are more interesting. But I'll go quickly through them. So through the last 50 years, we discovered that Galena experienced actually 12 moderate to severe flooding, with the worst floods being in 1971. And then 2014, Yedeytsi only had, I believe it's 8 floods, and the most recent ones were in 2010 and 2014. All of these floods had severe impacts on both communities. Galena has lost most of the infrastructure, including the airport, in 1944. And then Yedeytsi, being an agricultural state, they actually lost most of their cattle, as you can see from this graphic picture, which I'm sorry, maybe a little bit too graphic, as well as their pastures and also farmlands. We learned that residents in both communities actively monitor breakups and follow the flood information online, as well as through the available web resources. Here on the picture, you can see people in Galena actually watching the breakup flood in 2015, which was very calm. Oh, not the breakup flood, sorry, just the breakup, which was very calm and there was no flooding. But usually when breakup takes place, it's a big, almost social event for the communities, because it means that the spring is here. So people just gather around by the rivers and watch the river go by. Here are some of the interesting parts from the surveys. We can see the highest satisfactory ratings in Galena here. We can see that Galena City Administration, neighbors, and relatives provided the highest amount of assistance to impacted population, at least based on their opinion. And in Yedeytsi, it's also local administration, neighbors, and relatives. And that's actually very interesting, because overall local administration in both communities received really high ratings. And it is common knowledge that in disasters, it's actually your relatives and neighbors who provide the most assistance. But if you live in a small community which has less than 500 people, your local administration very frequently is actually your neighbors and family. So here are the main differences between flood management in rural Alaska and rural Sakha Republic. If you remember this graphic from a few slides before, you can see that in rural Sakha there are a lot of activities during the flood prevention and mitigation stage, and in rural Alaska, most of the activities, most of the assistance from the government comes after disaster already takes place. So here is just a graphic which shows overall satisfaction ratings. You can see that in Yedeytsi the satisfaction ratings are much higher, and the main reason for that is because actually they are more satisfied with the prevention and mitigation efforts, which I mentioned before. And here are some of the examples. Spring flood mitigation prevention efforts in Russia are definitely more proactive, but they are not necessarily effective. Because there are no actually statistical evidence of these things working, but I just wanted to share some of them with you. They actually engage in ice cutting. When ice jams form, they actually have special machines that would cut the ice to lessen the ice surface, or actually spread the coal dust to increase the melting. Then of course there is good old-fashioned ice jam blasting, and in actually a Russian Western Arctic, they use icebreakers to cut the ice jams in the rivers, and that actually seems to be the most effective. Then, of course, there are some structural and non-structural mitigation efforts in both communities. Some of the structural examples that in both communities houses were elevated on stilts. In Galina, we later on steel pilings, and in Yedeytsi in wooden pilings, which is very interesting because considering the impacts of the ice damage, it's not really clear whether the wooden pilings would be able to support the houses, but I guess we'll have to see. And then, of course, there is the question of levees or dikes, and that's actually what saved both communities. So after the airport was flooded in Galina in 1944, the Air Force actually built a levee. However, the levee, as you can see on the picture on the left, it only protects the airport, and the community itself is actually exposed to the flooding. But because the airport and all the infrastructure remains dry, people can actually seek shelter during the floods. And then in Yedeytsi, a levee was built after the flood in 2010. It was due to the financial restraints. It was a very long process. It took them 5 years to build them, but actually there was a big flooding on the Lena River this spring, and because of the levee, the community remained dry, so it worked. Some of the non-structural mitigation efforts include population relocation, which is usually a very challenging social process, and it is kind of frowned upon by population in both communities. So now let's go back to the causes of vulnerabilities. Why are those communities exposed and vulnerable to flooding? Why are they even where they are located right now? Originally, both Galina and Yedeytsi were formed abruptly by state governments. Both Alaskan Athabaskan people and native Sakha were nomads. They would not stay in one place, but they would actually travel throughout the state with the season. So they never actually faced flooding before. But after they were formed into these stable communities, they started to face flooding. And then those communities are also really rapidly expanded. So Galina became an airport base during World War II, during the Lend-Lease program. And then, of course, during the Cold War, it was very important strategic point. And then Yedeytsi at the same time was formed into a kolkhoz, so what we call a collective farm. And it is not originally agricultural state, so they had to put the farms by the river to support the cattle. And of course, they did not consider the potential of flooding. And the main reason also is that even though local and indigenous knowledge holders knew that these are not good ideas, that these communities would be prone to flooding, their opinions and knowledge was not included in the original decision making. So the key lessons here is that the communication and coordination are really the key to disaster risk reduction, disaster resilience. Communication should include all key actors and stakeholders, and communication should be incorporated at the early stages of disaster resilience planning, not when disaster strikes, but before it. And communication should, of course, be in the form of a dialogue and not just policymakers or emergency managers telling communities what to do. So basically, we need to create room for a dialogue and collaboration. That's exactly what we try to do through this project. We try to establish, no, we actually succeeded. We did establish a dialogue between all the different actors, between the communities and emergency managers and scientists in every community, but we also were able to create liaisons between the US and Russian peers, which was really important considering the fact that overall the geopolitical situation between the two countries has gone from bad to worse because of the crisis in Ukraine. So, and now we're going back to the overall topic of disaster diplomacy, and I just want to introduce some of the challenges we see so far. So if we look at disaster diplomacy strictly from a diplomatic perspective, from a multi-track diplomacy perspective, we can see that the main challenges would be politics. As I mentioned before, nations' foreign policies such as visa restrictions, travel restrictions, sanctions, of course, leadership change, and some of the historical grievances also play a role. And then from the academic standpoint, disaster diplomacy faces many challenges because it's actually a relatively new and still evolving discipline. The most of the publications can date back to only 20 years ago. So there is no really formal definition. There are no really generally accepted theory or formal principles or metrics of success. And metrics of success are especially very important when we evaluate case studies. So our goal right now is actually to advance disaster diplomacy, and the main reason how we want to do it is that to actually create a group of experts to formalize the definition, to formalize the metrics of success. So right now I'm working specifically on grants, specifically from the National Science Foundation. We want to build a research coordination network to work in the next 5 years, and it's going to be international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive. And together we're going to arrive at the common conclusion regarding the disaster diplomacy framework. And of course, we also publishing right now. I work with a variety of disaster experts as well as science diplomacy experts, trying to align some of the key ideas now. And we also have a series of events in the next couple of years, which if you are going to be at any of the events, I would like to see you there. We're going to be at the U-Arctic Congress in 2018. Also, the AAAS in the United States is going to have a conference on science diplomacy. AGU, which is the American Geophysical Union, is going to have a conference in December 2018, and we're going to have several sessions and presentations on disaster diplomacy. And also IUGG, which is International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics. I'm also going to have a series of workshops and sessions on disaster diplomacy. And the reason why it's important because conferences such as AGU and IUGG, they strictly focus on natural sciences, geophysical sciences. So the fact that they're actually opening up to include more policy, science policy and diplomacy is very encouraging. And all of the results we're going to capture in Springer 2020 edited volume. So that's the plans how we try to advance disaster diplomacy from Tufts University, because small efforts, but hopefully they will count. And here is just a quick summary of everything. So disaster is a complex physical and technological and socioeconomic phenomena that transcend political borders. That's why we need to address them together. International, interdisciplinary, and inclusive collaboration is really the key here to finding the ways to effective disaster resilience. Disaster diplomacy provides opportunities to advance our scientific knowledge of disaster, as well as simultaneously building bridges between states, and also the multiple political and academic ambiguities, which I mentioned in my previous slides, really need to be resolved for disaster diplomacy to develop to its full potential as an academic discipline, as well as an official diplomatic effort. And that's all I have for you today, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katia. I definitely learned a lot about communities and challenges that certainly I hadn't worked on, although I've been working on Arctic issues for quite some while. I try to refrain from asking all my questions right now because we already have a question from one of our fellows, and I'm happy to follow up on that question with mine later. But Diane, you get to start the discussion again, and I'll just give you the mic right now. There we go.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Of course, it's obvious that Russia did a lot more in terms of disaster preparation than the United States. And I'm thinking of two questions. One, can you explain why the United States has not kept up in preparing for disaster? And two, can you make any comparisons or do you have any knowledge about other Arctic nations?
Specifically for ice jam flooding?
Yes, or any disaster preparation, but for ice
jam.
Oh,
yeah. Well, so basically, we cannot say that United States doesn't, do a lot of preparation. It's just for that specific case study, for that specific disaster. And the main reason there, when we talk to emergency managers, is that they say that there is no statistical evidence, there is like no recorded evidence that these efforts necessarily work. So when the US Air Force was in Galena, because they pulled out in early 90s, when they had the base there, they actually performed ice dusting and ice cutting. However, there is no record of its effectiveness, unfortunately. So for example, FEMA or Alaska Department of Emergency Management, and FEMA, for those of you who don't know, it's a federal emergency management in the United States. It's the main one. It's the federal one. So they don't want to spend money on something they're not sure is going to lead to results. But that's an overall issue, is that we actually, of all disaster resilience efforts, only like 10% goes to mitigation and preparedness, which is really a shame. But we need to address it on a more policy level. But for politicians to actually allocate more money to disaster mitigation, it's not really wise for them, because they need to show results in 4 years while they're still in the power, right? So they can be elected again. They don't want to invest money in something which might not happen, because disasters might not happen the next year. They might happen, 10 years ago. Now, examples from other countries with ice jams. Ice jams are kind of tricky. As far as I know, Scandinavia does not really suffer from ice jams. It is actually predominantly Russian, US, and Canadian issue. So I cannot really speak for the other countries with certainty.
Could you maybe elaborate what you mean by ice jams? Apologies for my ignorance.
Oh, sure. So ice jams, if I can go back in my presentation, hold on. Can you see the slides moving?
Yeah, moving.
Okay. Fine. Yeah, so the ice jams right here. So this picture, yeah, yes. You can see, so that's the community on the Yukon River, and all the ice you see, that's actually the river. So it's, the ice jam is basically when ice has nowhere to go but to the community.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the clarification. All right, if there's any additional question, so Diana, if you want to follow up on that directly, you have still the mic. Otherwise, I'm happy to give the mic to someone else.
I do have one quick follow-up, and that is, I understand that in the United States, the politicians want to see evidence of their funds being used well, but more importantly, they're concerned about their re-election. So why is Russia so willing to do the preparation and the mitigation?
That's a that's a very good question. So usually when I can speak for ice jam flooding. I don't want to speak about other disasters because I'm not well aware about them. But when we talk about ice jam floods, is that it's actually in Russia, it's a year-round preparation and then response. There are a lot of communities which suffer from ice jam flooding. So when the spring comes upon Siberia, Russian emergency management gets a lot of money from the federal government, which they need to spend. So, and then they decide, then the local emergency management decides what they're going to spend money on. Are they going to spend it on blasting, on cutting, and etc. So I think the main answer would be here is that I think there are maybe more communities which are exposed to ice jams in Russia.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I think we do have another sort of comment from Tuli, who is commenting that they do have problems in Finland also with ice jams. So there seems to be some circumpolar problems. Tuli will follow up on that shortly, but in the meanwhile, maybe let me ask the question. I was wondering, because you mentioned this exchange and bringing together all the important stakeholders on the issue, and I agree from my experience in local communities in Germany, not so much on adaptation, but on mitigation measures, that really this sort of stakeholder exchange can be quite powerful and quite helpful. But with that sort of background knowledge, I was wondering whether you experience sort of roadblocks communication, sort of specifically regarding sort of the different power distribution in the different countries, because sometimes certain policies are on the national level, some are on the regional level, some are on the municipality level. And I was wondering, with regards sort of to disaster prevention and sort of adaptation measures, like how much is actually, or was in the case of flooding, in the hands of the local communities, and how much was actually sort of national policy? Because you mentioned we need to sort of bring some issues to the national policy level and to raise awareness. Sort of how much is there the power and capacity distribution in the US and in the Russian community?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So local communities have no power because they have no money. So local communities cannot do anything. They depend significantly on state and federal funds. With this specific project, I noticed that in both countries, the farther you went with policymakers, the more challenging it got to establish contact. So local community leaders, of course, they're excited to collaborate with scientists and emergency managers because they don't want to face this problem, you know, year after year or 5 years after 5 years. Actually, state politicians, both in Alaska and Sakha Republic, also very eager to establish contacts, to create better communication between them and the emergency managers and community leaders, because they saw the value in that, because they actually wanted to see what works, what doesn't work, what they can do better. But when we actually that would be individual groups. So that's not exactly like the main politicians, but individual state groups, right? Like, for example, the Alaskan Division of Homeland Security. But when we actually went to the politicians, such as Alaskan representatives, or, you know, the head of the Sakha Republic, this is where it's more challenged. And this is where it was very difficult to even, you know, get time to speak to them about that. And we actually, when we got to speak to them about that, they didn't seem to be really concerned about that. So they basically have a bigger fish to fry, I can say that. So the higher you go, the more challenging it is. Yeah, okay. In both countries. So, yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. So I would give the mic to Tuli if you want to specify for the Finnish case. There you go, Tuli.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for your presentation. So, greetings from Finland. So I was thinking that I need to add that, yes, we know the problem as well here in Finland. But one thing, when I'm looking at this picture, so the rivers you are now speaking about are really, really big in Finland. They are much smaller, so the ice jam cannot be that large. And I lived first in southern Finland, so there we do not have this kind of problems. But now, at the moment, I live in Rovaniemi, and Rovaniemi is at the polar circle. So here we know the problem. So the city is Rovaniemi, if you want to write it down, and then Ostrobothnia it means the western part of Finland. There they really know this problem, and it's really local problem, and basically along the river, you know, of course. And I know that army is in Finland that institution which helps with sandbags and all that. But if you want to have some cases, so then, for example, Rovaniemi and Ostrobothnia give the best examples.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's actually, that's another interesting point with the army. In Russia, they actually use army also quite a bit when it's very severe ice jam floods. In United States, no. So that might be interesting difference.
Great. Thank you for the helpful additions, Tuli. And so I think we are open to have one or two more questions. We are sort of nearing the end of our webinar already. And of course, Bernhard, you are more than welcome to ask some questions to Katia as well. Or Katia, if you have wanted to comment on Bernhard's presentation, you're more than welcome to, so we can have the expert to expert exchange as well. Otherwise, so in the meanwhile, I'll give sort of like another minute maybe to follow up on the questions. But I maybe just to let me ask you, Katia, sort of, did you experience any difficulties sort of within sort of disciplinary boundaries? Sort of, was it sort of like sort of natural scientists research that was difficult to translate? You mentioned the difficulty with the different policy levels, but I guess that's true for, you know, the higher in the ladder you get, the more difficult it will always be to find some concerns or to find the right tone. But did you find it particularly difficult to come from sort of like with these natural science sort of evidence and problems to bring this to policymakers? Did you encounter there any problems?
Not really, actually. Because when we talk about ice jam floods, we really cannot study it from strictly natural perspective. We can, of course, you know, because it's important to learn about the natural drivers of ice jam floods, right? Because if we want to come up with mitigation efforts, we need to know exactly what causing it. So, but if we talk about communities' well-being, we really need social scientists there as well. We need economists. So that's and I think that when we put together the team, it was really well understood. So nobody was like pulling a blanket on themselves. The main challenge came actually when we were doing publications. So because to find a journal where you can submit such interdisciplinary research, right, that's a little bit more challenging, because a lot of natural journals which focus on flooding, like they would be like, well, it's too much social science for us, we don't really want that. And then social, you know, journals which focus on social science, they said the same thing, but about the natural perspective, because it would be too much for their readers, right, general readers. So that was the main issue. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think I'll head over to Andreas. Andreas, please join the discussion round, and you wanted to add something, please.
No, I don't actually want to thank you very much for letting me in. I didn't actually want to add anything to the discussion here today, but really sort of speak to you with the camera on after I was forced to just send an email to everybody or a Facebook post to everybody last week when I was caught in the depth of East Germany, where the trains run slow and without Wi-Fi, so I couldn't actually dial in and say anything. But I've written up what I wanted to say. I just wanted to show my face and say welcome to all of the fellows that are here, and indicate to them again that this is a unique opportunity to learn from one another, to learn different perspectives, focus on different disciplines. Katia, thank you for pointing out the difficulty, the lack of recognition for good interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research that we have today, and to have all the presentations from all the different perspectives. Thank you very much, Bernhard, for your contribution today, which really laid the foundation in everybody who has not focused on it, understanding what is happening in the Arctic and what are the driving factors behind it. And as we go through the Arctic Summer College this year, all the fellows will see all the different presentations with all the different themes, the different backgrounds, but also hear the different accents of the people who all contribute to the knowledge base, and they're all involved also in the common effort of finding the right governance system to deal with all the challenges, because as you, Katia, said, it's very far away from the capitals of the countries. And in many cases, it's much easier, much better to cooperate amongst northerners, people who live in the region, than to wait for help coming from the capitals that are far away. And it's in that spirit, cooperation across the time zones and across the various disciplines and across the various language areas and policy areas that we want to encourage. And it has worked every year so far. So I have every faith that it will work this year, and I look forward to all the different sessions. As time goes by, we will get to know one another a little bit better. I look forward to it. It's great every year, and I have every faith it will be great this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for your kind words, and let me just join you in thanking our experts today. I think we are done with the questions for the time being, but of course we'll be inviting our experts to join our Facebook group if they want to, and otherwise all the you fellows, you can approach us with the coordinator at arcticsummercollege.org email address and send us any specific questions that might come into your head afterwards. Of course, we'll be happy to provide the direct contacts to the experts, for instance, Tuli and Katia. If you want to follow up on the Rovaniemi ice jams, let us know what's coming out of that cooperation, and that's what we're here for. With that, I think I'll hand over back to Brendan and let you sort of announce the next steps for the group presentations. And we have it 3 minutes to 8, so thank you again to our experts. If you need to run, you're more than welcome to enjoy the second semi-final of the World Cup now. If not, you're of course more than welcome to listen in for the last couple of minutes as well. But thank you again for joining us today, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Arna. Actually, before you take off for the evening, I want to say thank you for moderating, doing a nice job of leading the discussion and asking good questions. Your experience in the Arctic, I think, is really coming through and helps make these conversations more accessible to more people. So I really appreciate that. And Katia, I wanted to let you know our office in Washington is actually right across the street from the brand new or newly retrofitted AGU building, which is an absolute shrine to passive houses and zero energy. What they've done with their retrofitting is amazing. We toured it just a couple of weeks ago. So when you are there, be sure to get in touch with us because we are right across the street, and it would be a lot of fun to see what you're presenting there. So
yeah, thank you. Absolutely, it's exciting.
Yeah. So if there are no more questions or no more discussions, please, Bernhard, go ahead.
I also want to thank you for the invitation. For me, that's the first time I made a webinar, so but it's a very nice format for discussion.
It's no, thank you very much, and it's always one of the reasons I demanded that Arna, I promised him a beer in Iceland later this year if he would manage the moderation, because I can't handle the technical side of things very well. So I appreciate your patience in working through all of those, and also with the fellows for hanging in there, because it can always be a little bit uncertain. But it is an amazing method, an amazing way to get such a diverse group of people together. And as Andreas always talks about, there's no Arctic studies if there isn't this diversity of engagement from across the globe, really. So it requires a little bit of flexibility and adaptability, but that's what we talk about so much. So I guess we should walk the walk as well. So thank you all very much for that. I want to, if that's all right, go ahead and switch over our topic here a little bit more administrative and schoolhouse oriented things. Open it up to the participants to discuss any issues that they might be having regarding the group projects that they're putting together. I know the environmental sciences group is presenting next week, which is coming up quite soon, of course. And I've noticed that you do have some conversation going. I think that's phenomenal. I just want to make sure you feel confident going forward, if you have any questions, anything you want to talk about at this point, or if you already know your topic and would like to share that with us, yeah, I'd just like to know how it's going, and if anybody else has any questions regarding their groups or the structure of the group presentation, go ahead, raise your hand, or otherwise type something in the question field so I can know about it. But of course, if everybody feels comfortable and confident and would much rather watch the second semifinal, I do understand and am more than happy to answer any questions on via email or set up a discussion format with you at another point in time as well. Okay. Well, I don't want to force anybody. Oh, Autumn Lynn, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Do you want to go ahead and let me know?
Sure. I'm part of the first group, so I'll ask this question on behalf of our group. I noticed today that the presenters both use PDF format for their presentations, and so I was curious to know whether that is the preferred or most stable format for us to use for our presentations.
Yeah. Please, Arna, go ahead.
I'm happy to weigh in on that. We do. I mean, the software itself, it's fine. It can also handle PowerPoint presentations, but as we figured out over the last years, PowerPoints, especially when they're image heavy, and usually the natural sciences have a little more imagery than the lawyers do, then it takes a while to send all these images through the pipeline. And for some reason, the PDF format is somewhat smaller and more easy to present on that. So while you can, I mean, if you want to focus on transitions between the slides, PowerPoint is still the way to go, and you can do that. But then sort of if it's like a shorter presentation with less pictures, then it's definitely easier and it's transmitted much quicker. So that's the only concern you should have. But if you sort of prepare PowerPoint and then convert it to PDF, then it's even faster, and we shouldn't face any trouble.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, I would recommend. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So as long as your question is answered, I would, just for everybody else, follow up with what Arna said and say it is a good idea, if possible, just to put it in PDF. It also makes it easier to share and for us to post it on our website as well. So that's always nice. Tuli, you have a question, I believe. If you want to go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm in the governance group, and I have had email contact with Diane and Visaka, and I think that there is a fourth one. At least in the Asana system, there is private user, but is it the moderator or is somebody missing?
Yeah, let me look real quickly. In the governance group, we have. Yeah, okay, yeah, it was Elif from Turkey. She was unable to continue participation in the group, so she's not going to be part of the presentation.
Okay.
I'm sorry. We didn't get in there and take her out, but yeah, she was at the last minute unable to participate. So the three of you will be the group then.
Yeah, and then what was your idea about the topic? Because we have, of course, different backgrounds, and we have had some conversation about the topic. So do you know about the expert keynote speaker? So does she or he speak about the Arctic Council, for example, or about some other institution? What is his or her background? So we could continue from that, or then we have discussed, for example, if there's something about ethics, something about challenges in the Arctic governance. So what?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go ahead and jump in just to let you know. Most of our speakers, or a couple of our speakers, two of the three who will be presenting during the governance section, are going to focus more on international governments in the Arctic Council. So it would be an option to continue in that direction, to kind of follow up on what they're going to be discussing. But at the same time, it would be great if you present, and I know that you're working on the Arctic Council, so it would fit in with what you're doing quite well. But the idea for the presentation is really for you to come up with your own way of telling the story and answering your own research questions. So whatever the three of you can come up with, we'll support however you would like. So I think that, oh, bye Bernhard, thank you very much, and have a good evening. So Tuli, again, what I would say is it might be interesting not so much to focus on a group, you know, or an entity, but perhaps maybe a question that is relevant to Arctic governance, and then look at how different entities are answering or looking to solve that problem. That would just be one way of doing it without focusing on just one entity, but it's really up to you. We have, hate to say it, but absolutely no preconceived notions about what the topic should be or how it should be run. Does that help at all?
Well, yes. Yes, thank you. But we need to continue the conversation with the group, I think so.
Okay, if there's any way, oh, Arna, if you need to go, I understand. Have a good evening.
No, sorry. I was just going to add like 2 cents on the governance angle. So I think focusing on one forum is one thing, but also like it's a question whether you want to focus on the forum in itself and in sort of like its own capacities and competences, or if you want to look into the interplay of that specific forum with other fora. So for instance, with regard to the Arctic Council, you could also have a look at its sort of work and submissions of Arctic states at the IMO towards the Polar Code, for instance. You could look at the inclusion of OSPAR Commission as an Arctic Council observer in recent years. You could look at sort of like the agreements or the moratorium on fisheries that Arctic states negotiated, not quite under the Arctic Council, but sort of like how that forum helped facilitate that. There are so many perspectives and sort of different connections from the Arctic Council and its member states to other forums that might be also interesting to look at. So even if you focus on one forum specifically, there are so many options you can like turn this.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good point. And I think that another thing that you kind of tangentially brought up there was the idea of the interaction between these different groups. And even like Katia was talking about, you know, the difference between these local administrations and how they respond and their limitations, as well as then going larger and larger into national governments or even these supranational organizations. Okay. So does that help for now, Tuli?
Yes, thank you.
Very good, thank you. Mariana, you have your hand raised. What's your question?
So everyone can hear me?
Yes, yeah, quite well, thank you.
I was not sure if this is working. So hello to the group again. Well, this time in person. So Mariana speaking from Berlin, and as you already noticed or mentioned, that our group will be presenting next week, and we are now ready in the, let's say, in the pre-preparation phase and then discussion of our presentation. So I have 2 questions actually regarding this presentation. So first question would be, what is still not really clear for me, if we are 3 people presenting one presentation, so each one will have a part of this presentation, or this should be 3 separate presentations to one topic? That is one question. And the second one, during our discussion, there probably some kind of a misunderstanding came up or not clear to everyone. I understood that we are supposed to choose a subject or a topic from natural science field. And I think it was Autumn Lin who was saying that maybe we're supposed to present speak about natural science in the Arctic. So there, I would like also to be more clear regarding that. So if there's just as a subject that we're choose from that, or really focus on natural science and then just speak more regarding that.
Okay, well, let me start with the first question because I think that's the easiest, although there is no real answer. You can choose however works best. One of the things that I prefer it if there's one presentation that the three of you work on together, just because I like the idea of working together and developing, a presentation collaboratively. It's kind of the idea of Arctic Summer College as well, that people from all over the place are working together on certain issues. So our inclination would be that there's one primary research question that the three of you work together to answer. Now, how that looks might be different. How the work will be aufgeteilt. How you're going to divide up the effort will depend on a whole lot of variables, including, for example, internet connection. Zara, who calls in, for example, because she's not in a place with very regular internet connection, might not be the best person to do the actual presentation. She might back it up or put together the PDF or do some extra research or something. So it might not be that all three people speak, although that would be great. It's more an issue of, figuring out what each person is capable of doing based on the limitations or situation that they find themselves in. But yeah, I do like the idea of it being one specific. Now, the only difference there, or the only, I think an exception, not the only, but certainly an exception, for example, is if you have a topic where maybe all members are doing specific research or individual research in their other lives that they all want to present, that all relate to the topic, that could be very interesting too. It's kind of a potpourri or to show the diversity of the topic in and of itself. That's always an option. But that said, I do think the original idea is better, or at least, it's not, you don't have 2 hours, you have about 30 to 40 minutes maximum for the presentation. So one topic is probably the best way to go. The second question, about picking the topic. Yeah, that's, especially with the environmental sciences, I would be interested in something more natural sciences based. Of course, climate change is a natural science in a lot of ways. I would just, it's a hard question. It really focuses on what you all want to, are most interested in and what kind of research you're able to do for the presentation. But yeah, I do like the idea that you focus as much as possible on natural sciences, environmental sciences, because we do get into governance and energy and some of these other areas more, later on in the program. Does that help at all, or not really?
Well, can you hear me, or?
Yeah. No, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, I think yes for now, because probably we'll have to discuss more about that. But just to make sure that I understood you, so climate change, you would say that would be a topic that would be probably covered by later presentations. So we should rather focus more, like really more straight on natural science.
Yeah, so a little bit. I would, yes, no, for non-German speakers. I would suggest that climate change can certainly be an environmental science. It's just that it often gets picked up by governance or policy, or it gets sort of abducted by policy discussions immediately. And so that's why I tend to shy away from it a little bit. But I think that especially with the Arctic, it's nearly impossible to avoid the topic of climate change. So I don't think it's something that you have to shy away from. But I do think that there's a lot in terms of environmental sciences. Bernhard talked about it a little bit in his presentation about the fish, and the flora and fauna of the Arctic, and how how they are changing. I think that's something that we are missing a little bit from our program this year, and so I would really appreciate it if that's a direction that your group chose to go in. But as I said, there's no climate change is not something that we're going to disregard, and it is something that has a lot, is founded in the natural sciences. So, so that is certainly an option. But as I said, I'm happy to talk with the whole group, specifically, especially if you want to hash out a topic, or talk over email. I can also join the discussion on the Asana page. But no, I really think that yeah, I think that you can go both ways on that pretty easily.
Okay, well, thank you much for the thanks a lot for the clarification, and I think we'll start the discussion from here with each other. And yeah, it's great. Thank you for offering also to join our discussion and to support us in that. So that would be probably very helpful.
Okay, great. Yeah. No, and that's something I want to let everybody know, that we are here for these discussions. You just have to let us know that you want us to join the conversations. We did keep them a little bit public on Asana, so we can jump in and look at what's happening, but we don't want to control it either. So if you ask us to participate, we certainly will. I think that's all of the raised hands.
I think there's one more question on the question panel by Dario.
And then there's how do we see the schedule for our group presentation? Dario, I think I sent you an invitation for for Asana, and let me see where you would be. Yeah, you're in the energy and resources presentation. That one is scheduled to take place on August 1st. So you have, what, 3 weeks? So you have a little bit of time. And who else is in the group? Okay, so yeah, you do have a little bit of time. I will let you know. I just got an email, or we just got an email about 5 minutes before tonight's session started, that Chris, the one in your Asana group whose picture is up, is sick and will not be able to participate in the Arctic Summer College this year. So your group has shrunk slightly, so you have a little more, you have fewer people that you have to negotiate with, so you can figure out what you want to do. But again, with the dwindling number in your group, we can certainly be here to help in any way necessary. So don't be afraid to reach out and let us know if we can be of help. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have. I want to let you all know, we were very lucky this week. David from last year was unable to participate because of a family emergency. He may be able to join us toward the end of the program, which would be really nice to present the paper that he published that he started working on actually last year during the Arctic Summer College. But in our efforts to find somebody to replace him, before Katia was able to confirm, we did get another speaker, Dr. Burke, actually, and she didn't have a presentation, but we did interview her. And so we have an interview, and Max, I believe, has left, so he can't really talk too much about it. He's the one who led who did the interview, but we have an interview that we'll post with her discussion. It's really quite interesting, so it should be so it's kind of like an extra half session for us this year, which is nice. So you'll see that either via email or probably just posted on the Facebook page. But she's at the University of Southern Denmark University doing pretty fascinating research into environmental sciences in the Arctic. So that's just another resource for you that we'll put up, and maybe that can even help to inspire next week's presentation. And we will let you know when that comes up. Until next week, same time, same place, please do just get in touch with us via email at the coordinator at arcticsummercollege.org address, and we'll be happy to answer any questions and help you through this process. Diane, I know you mentioned something about the presentations. Some of our presenters are very keenly aware of difficulty in publishing data that hasn't been published before and making it open to the public. We do have channels, of course, where we can share presentations and information with just participants in the Arctic Summer College. But we first ask and verify with each of our presenters, and as soon as the presentations, the slides, or any information become available, we will certainly share it with you and let you know how to access it. So until next, oh, sorry, one more thing. Diane, I saw your email that you are planning on attending the Arctic Circle Assembly in Iceland this year. I want to say wonderful. That's very exciting. And also let you know that Arctic Summer College is a part of 2 different breakout sessions this year. And we will, which is very exciting, it's our first time having 2. One is on security issues, and the other one is on participation and who's allowed to participate in governance structures in the Arctic. So we will share more information about that in the coming weeks. We invite everybody who can, we can't pay for the flight, of course, but we invite everybody who can make it to Iceland to join us when we're there, and we'll try to set up some sort of a reunion because quite a few alumni of the Arctic Summer College lead their own breakout sessions as well. So it's quite an exciting time to run into old friends, and it would be great to include as many of you as possible there this year. So we can all dream of cold weather as we trudge through the summer days, and like I said, please let us know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we will see you next week, Wednesday at the same time. Thank you again, Arna, for the great moderation. And Max will be back next week as well. So we will see you all then. Till then, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.